All right, gang, I'm going to go ahead and give you guys a real quick version of the lecture on the Industrial Revolution here. Not going to take a whole lot of time here. Just going to kind of give you the high points, the origins, what it was like, briefly, kind of how it got going, and then the short-term and the long-term effects of the Industrial Revolution. Then in the next video, we'll talk about the urban game, and we'll play that together online. So first of all, take a look at what the state of Virginia wants you to learn, or I'm sorry, the Commonwealth of Virginia wants you to learn right here. Pause it if you need to. All right, so let's talk. First of all, why did the Industrial Revolution start in Britain? First of all, we have to understand, one, what the Industrial Revolution was. And it was primarily a radical change and a shift in the way that business or things, products were made and how they were completed and how they were built. And that was a major change, and that's what is so revolutionary. So first of all, why Britain? Well, in order to understand why Britain, we have to start back and we have to look at what are some things that are involved when we make any product. Well, there are three factors of production, and we're going to talk about these in more detail when we get to talk about capitalism and communism or socialism. But first of all, let's talk about the factors of production as they exist. First of all, there are three factors of production. Land. Land is two parts. One, land means the actual raw materials that you get to make any product, like a shirt. This shirt I'm wearing is either made of silk or cotton or polyester, or some sort of blend of that. I don't know. I didn't look. But in order to get the silk or the cotton, you've got to have land. You actually have to get the raw materials to do it. The second part of the land item is labor. Or I'm sorry, is the actual place where you're going to put your plant, your factory, whatever. So do you have both the raw materials and the space to create whatever you're making? Secondly, you've got labor, and that is basically human resources. Who are going to be the people producing the items that you're making? In our case, it's going to be mostly focused on shirts or textiles. Okay, so that's labor, and involved in that is how much education, skill, and all that good stuff. But we're talking about humans that actually produce it. So the labor. And last but not leastly is capital. And by capital, I simply mean money. Those people or capital or money needed to invest in the creation of a product or in the building of anything up to the factory itself, the machine. Who's got the capital or the money to pay for anything like that? Well, so let's go more into why Britain. Well, first of all, there are several different reasons why Britain was so fortunate. If you look on your notes pages there, if you're following along on your notes, you look at the potato. And the potato had a really important impact on British society and European society as a whole. If you read the example there that is in your notes, what you're going to notice is that the potato basically provided a lot of health and nourishment benefits to the British and to all of Europeans, and that allowed their population to grow. Now, I'm probably laying it on a little thick and putting a whole lot of credit or too much credit to the potato, but it cannot be understated how important the potato was to the population of both the island of Britain and the island of Ireland and of Europe as a whole, because it was a cheap, readily available food source that improved the lives of a lot of people. Secondly, population began to boom thanks to that potato. So agricultural revolution, you had an increase in agriculture with the potato. Lots of people began to eat it. Because they were eating more healthy food, they were able to survive longer just based on pure, plain old nutrition. The population began to grow. Infants began to get older. Families were able to survive childbirth. Women were able to survive childbirth. And so that was part of it. Well, as the population begins to grow, England, and this is one of the things that will be better illustrated in the urban game, goes through what's called the enclosure movement. Well, Britain, what they do is they take all this public land that was used to be used by everyone to farm, and now the Parliament says, no, we're going to take this land and we're going to end up giving it to wealthy landowners and wealthy farmers. Well, they're not giving it to them; they're selling it to these people. It's not the small-time farmers, small-time landowners that can afford it. It's only the wealthy ones, and so that provides, one, places to build things and make things, but two, it also provides a readily available workforce, because the people that were once farming in the commons are no longer farming in the commons, and so they have to seek jobs elsewhere so they can provide food for their family. Nextly, Great Britain had an abundance of natural resources, specifically coal. Coal was really important to the Industrial Revolution because it provided a heat source. Now, Wood was also used as a heat source, but Britain had coal pretty much laying on top of the ground. You didn't have to dig very deep like you do in the mountains of southwest Virginia or West Virginia to get to the coal, and so it was easily available and readily available. Nextly, Britain had markets. What are markets? Markets are places to sell goods. There was a demand at home in Britain, that's the domestic market, for goods, for products that people could buy and people could spend their money on. Clothes in particular. British wages, I've read, British wages were much higher than they were in the rest of the world. And so that's one of the reasons why the Industrial Revolution happened there, is because those people could afford to buy products produced by machines and could afford to buy products for consumption. And the empire. The British Empire also provided a place where they could get or buy the raw materials easily. India is a great example of that, where they could buy the raw materials easily, go back home, go back to Britain and produce them. So the first major industry to be affected by the Industrial Revolution was the textile industry. So if the Industrial Revolution is a radical change in how goods, services, etc. are produced, goods in particular, let's talk about how things were done before the Industrial Revolution. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, industries used what's called the cottage industry, or the putting out system. It's where you basically did things at home. Now, what would happen is women would work at home in the 16 and early 1700s, and one of the things they would do is they would spin thread. They would take wool or cotton that they would buy in bales, and then they would spin it into fine thread that would then be given to someone else who would weave it in a cloth. So one woman would make the thread, put it all together, and then it might go to the next house or another building over, or some other town possibly even, to be made into fabric into the cloth and a loom. And then from the cloth, fabric, it went to somebody to make their own clothes, etc. Well, the radical shift in the Industrial Revolution is that all of this process became mechanized. Machines began doing it because people invented machines that worked more quickly and more easily and were able to more efficiently get the job done. Control, Shift, F9, pause. All right, so sorry about that pause, but what I wanted to come back and show you guys was this right here. Okay, this is called a flying shuttle. See it? Look, it flies. It's like an airplane. But anyway, this was actually one of the major advancements of the Industrial Revolution. It's one of the ways that made cloth or fabric production more efficient and more cheap and quick to produce. Well, so what are some of the steps that we took toward getting the factories? Well, there were several steps. One, in the early 1700s, this little baby right here was invented. The flying shuttle took thread and you put a little spool of thread, I believe right there, and it came out here, and you use this thing, moving it back and forth, and you use that to create cloth, to create fabric. You take a lot of thread, and you use that to create your fabric. Well, the flying shuttle was invented in the early 1700s to quicken that process. Well, about half a century later, a guy named James Hargreaves invented something called the spinning jenny. He named it for his daughter. And what the spinning jenny did was it increased production and sped up production of thread. So the flying shuttle made production of fabric quicker, but that only increased the demand for thread. Well, they didn't have a mechanized way to create thread yet, and so Hargreaves came up with this idea, and his idea was to put multiple bits of cotton or wool or whatever they were making the thread with, put it on a spindle, and he figured out a way to do that here with the spinning jenny, and that's right there. Now, so we've got thread being produced quickly, then we've got the fabric which is being produced quickly, but now the thread is being produced more quickly than the fabric can keep up. In walked Cartwright's power loom in 1787. Cartwright's power loom in 1787, or 1785 as my notes say here. He invented a thing that took several strands of thread, as you can see here, and it wove it all together in a solid bolt of cloth. And it did all this mechanized. All someone had to do was sit there and help move things back and forth, and that was it. It greatly lessened the work on individuals. It sped up the process. It made the whole entire thing more efficient, from getting the raw material out of the ground, just a little bit, we'll come to that in a minute, to making the thread with the spinning jenny, to then making the cloth with the power loom. Well, speeding things up even more, this power loom right here The problem, and then there's an earlier thing that we'll talk about in the urban game called James Arkwright's water frame. It made fabric, but you had to be tied to a river to run your machines. Well, James Watt in the 1760s and then again in 1782 really refined the production and power. But what he did was he created the steam engine. The steam engine, you had an outside power source or heat here that would drive steam and push a piston up. The steam would be released and it would fall back down. All of this spinning, this wheel right here. And what happened is this steam engine was able to power all of these machines that were created as part of the Industrial Revolution. And so these steam engines got attached to these things. The good thing about that was you could go anywhere. Your factory didn't have to be tied to a river, like we'll talk about on the urban game. So now the actual end production of fabric is quickened or hastened. Well, now let's talk about the raw material. Up to this point, up to the late 1700s, you still had to have lots of manpower to harvest the cotton and then to pick the little balls or the little seeds out of the cotton so you could actually get thread out of the cotton fabric or out of the cotton thing, out of the cotton ball itself. Well, Eli Whitney solved that problem in 1793, and so here's what he did. Well, he said there's got to be a way to get this burr, this stone, this seed out of this cotton. And so what he came up with is basically just a drum with combs on it that rolled around and slowly picked out the seeds out of the cotton. It basically pulled the fibers out until all the fibers were pulled off of the seed, and the seed or the stone would drop down here at the very bottom. And all it took was one person cranking the shaft, or maybe hooked up to a steam engine that would crank the shaft. Well, Britain primarily got most of its cotton, at this point in time anyway, from the American South. So obviously in the American South, one of the major characteristics of the South was slavery. And so the initial effect of the Industrial Revolution on slavery was to increase the demand. So southern plantation owners in the United States said, hey, we got to have more slaves. We've got to have this so we can pick more cotton, so we can put it in the cotton gin to meet England's, not only England's, but also the Northeast in the United States, their demand for cotton, for fabric. Well, what eventually happened, though, was later on it actually led to a decrease in the demand for slavery. The reason there was a decrease in demand for slavery is because Great Britain figured out that they could get cotton more cheaply from their own empire in the Indian subcontinent. They grew cotton in the Indian subcontinent. They had a cheap source of labor that they still paid. It wasn't slavery. But all in all, the total cost was cheaper to get the raw materials from them than from importing it from the United States. So let's talk about some of the long-term effects of the Industrial Revolution. Some of the long-term effects on agriculture were, one, there was a tremendous increase in agricultural production. The production of crops became more quick, more efficient. We were able to produce more food with less people working the land, which decreases the labor force involved in agriculture. There are a couple of examples. Animals began to pull machines, which eventually led to combines, which eventually led to tractors, which all sped up agricultural production. Okay? On population, because less people working in agriculture, there was an excess people to work. Well, not only were less people working in agriculture, but also the population exploded as a result of the Industrial Revolution. People are moving into cities at a rapid rate. The population increased because there was more food being produced more efficiently, and even, one would argue, more healthy food was increased. People had more money to spend to buy food, and so again, population increased. Also, there were tremendous sanitation benefits, which again we'll talk about here in a few minutes when you guys play the urban game. Towns, cities began to grow. This is the massive move or shift of the world to urban centers. The developed world today would not be considered developed if it were not for the Industrial Revolution. In fact, you could argue that countries that are developing simply just have not hit the Industrial Revolution. I would always argue that the Industrial Revolution itself lasted from about 1650 or 1700 and is still going on today, depending on where you are in the world. So in a developed country like the United States, Britain, or most of Western Europe, today, you're clearly developed. In sub-Saharan Africa, depending on where you are, the levels of development could greatly vary. Environment. there were tremendous negative impacts on the environment. There were no regulations to how much pollution these plants could put out, these factories could put out. There were no regulations on where they could dump their waste. There were no regulations at all. And so basically the environment was pretty devastatingly harmed. However, without the damage to the environment, we wouldn't have also had the other positive effects that we do see. Education began to increase. Because there were a group of people who are now more wealthy, and we'll talk about the middle class in a second, education began to spread. It began to be common knowledge that every person, the entire public should be educated with at least some modicum or a little bit of forced schooling. Society, there were major societal shifts. The urban game really highly illustrates that, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it right now. But societal shifts. The family unit began to change fundamentally and forever as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Families were no longer these massive extended families, but now what we're going to call the nuclear family, where it's really just mom, dad, and their kids. Occasionally you get parents living with their children, but it's not a terribly common concept, whereas prior to the Industrial Revolution, it was. The working class lives, you could argue, suffered greatly because of this. Working class lives, their income went down, the supply of food for them went down, and so their lives really radically changed during the Industrial Revolution. Although I would also argue that today, as we're coming out of the Industrial Revolution, that their lives are much better off than they were before the Industrial Revolution. Men, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, often saw their livelihoods taken away from them. They figured out, capitalists quickly figured out that women were cheaper to employ. They could pay them less, and they got the same work done. So women and children began employed in factories, and so the role of men really it emasculated or feminized them and took away their role as a primary breadwinner. Now, again, men, you could argue, had those traditional dominant roles of middle management or management, etc., and so many might have still done that. But the working class men definitely suffered as a result of the revolution. Women, whose place in the home had always been seen to be in the house, whose role in the world had been secondary to men, now begin to see that they are breadwinners, begin to see that they are earning money to help support their family, which they had always done, but now they're doing it outside of the home, which is a dramatic shift. Traditionally, women made money, but it was inside the home. Now they are moving that shift outside the home. The working class children really heavily suffered because of this as well. Working class children were put to work just as they always had been in farms and factories, or not factories, but on farms and homes. But now the working class children are having to work in factories where the conditions are much more dangerous and it's much more difficult to survive if you fall and you have an accident in there. The middle class began to grow also as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Middle class would be managers. Teachers arguably became part of what was a growing middle class. And this group that are not the working class, the very bottom of society, poorest in society, or the upper class, but this group somewhere in the middle who help manage the day-to-day operations of factories and plants. Their standing in society grew and their place grew, as well as their money, and they were able to buy and afford new things as the Industrial Revolution ended and continues today. All right, those are some of the quick causes, effects, and kind of in the middle of what happened during the Industrial Revolution. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Sorry it was so long.